This podcast is created in partnership with Montclair. First comes the fatigue of exertion, then the joy of reunion. Finally, the apprehension for the coming descent. Compagnoni, Lacedelli, and the other companions are deeply proud of having reached the summit of K2. But now isn't the time for them to bask in glory. First of all, at Camp 8, at 7,600 meters of altitude, there's both excitement for the achievement and pain for the frostbite incurred by Lacedelli and Compagnoni on their hands, and Amir Mahdi on his feet. Bonatti, Gallotti, Abram, and Isakan rush to their aid, melting snow and preparing tea. The night goes on forever, and none of the company manage to sleep. Everyone is thinking about the following day, about the perils of the coming descent. The group is still far away from the base camp, but it'll take another 2,600 meters down before they can count themselves in the clear. It's not easy, but none of them, not for a moment, regret taking part in the expedition. "70 years ago, two Italians conquered K2, the second highest summit in the world. In this podcast, we tell their story to understand how important it was for an entire country. I'm John Vincent, and this is K2, Like Going to the Moon, a Cora Media podcast. Without the technology and communication devices of today, organizing an expedition on the other side of the world, in an unexplored place such as this, is a terribly complicated task. This is why, in 1954, they choose Ardito Desio, a geologist from the northeastern Friuli region of Italy, as the leader of the team. Desio is almost 60 years old and well known for his gruff temperament, to put it lightly. But this attitude is also key to the success of K2, a merit that even his critics can't deny. Critics such as Reinhold Messner, the first man to climb all 14 8,000ers. Desio's surliness is quite effective, not only for the expedition of 1953, but also in dealing with companies, financiers, and in choosing the men that will follow him in climbing the second tallest mountain in the world. The first step after obtaining the permission to climb the peak of K2 was to choose the right mountaineers. Each section of the Alpine Club was asked to recommend proper candidates, and they also took into account experienced climbers such as Attilio Tissi, an academic at the Alpine Club, as well as an ex-member of the Resistance and current Socialist Member of Parliament. Out of the 27 names that the consultation decided on, they needed to come up with a short list of 9. Desio would later say that the final choice was made by the club, and that he added 2 more, Walter Bonatti and Gino Soldà. However, 2 names were visibly left out: Riccardo Cassin, who followed Desio on the exploration of 1953, and Cesare Maestri, known as the Spider of the Dolomites. Cesare would claim that he was snubbed due to being a communist sympathizer, while Cassin may have been left out precisely because of his fame and charisma. After all, there had been clashes between him and Desio already during the previous expedition. In any case, the official version was due to his physical fitness, which is a little hard to believe considering that he was in peak condition and would later take part in difficult climbs, such as Gasherbrum 4 in Denali. The final team was made up of 11 mountaineers who mostly spoke in local Italian regional dialect. including Erik Abram from South Tyrol. Italy itself was still poor at the time. Few of the team were from the middle class, and only one of them even had a degree. The youngest, Walter Bonatti, would turn 24 at the base camp. The oldest, Gino Soldat, was 47 and a strong Dolomite climber. The group was made up of mountaineering scholars, famous climbers, and alpine guides. Each one of them had a different job back home. Some were craftsmen, others managed lodges. Pino Gallotti from Milan was a chemical engineer. Abram was a refrigeration technician. Cirillo Florianini, a mine sector designer. Ugo Angelino, a sales agent. Furthermore, Mario Puscio was a farmer. Sergio Viotto, a carpenter. Ubaldo Rei managed a mountain lodge. Compagnoni, on the other hand, was both a guide and a hotel manager. Lacedelli, the squirrel of Cortina, would split his time between ironmongering and climbing in the Dolomites. None of them had ever experienced extreme altitudes, nor had they ever taken a plane. Despite not receiving compensation and not being allowed to say anything about the expedition, none of them could wait to go. It was the chance of a lifetime. The team also included the climber and doctor Guido Pagani, as well as camera operator Mario Fantin, who wasn't yet a mountaineer himself, but would get bitten by the bug on this very occasion. And finally, 4 scientists, chosen by Ardito Desio personally: topographer Francesco Lombardi, geophysicist Antonio Marussi, paleontologist Paolo Graziosi, and geologist Bruno Zanettin. Each candidate needed to undertake rigorous medical exams, first in Milan and then in Turin, at the University Physiology Lab. They were closed into a hyperbaric chamber, which recreated the pressure conditions of thin air at 8,000 meters and above. A sort of necessary torture, as none of them had experience of high altitudes. After all, only a handful of them had even scaled the 4,800 meters of Mont Blanc, and now they would be facing 8,000 meters. After the lab tests, it was time to attempt high altitudes. There were 2 training grounds. The first at Plateau Rosa, below the Klein Matterhorn, from January 18, 1954, for 10 days, with temperatures below 27 degrees, and the second on Monte Rosa for 9 days. It wasn't just about testing the strength of the men, but also the materials. These were the first to be delivered, and they needed to be severely tested to make sure that they would be up to the task up on K2. They tried out equipment from several companies, as well as the new tents, which were more advanced than those used in previous Himalayan expeditions. The double internal walls of these were tested in cotton, wool, silk, and nylon for K2. In the end, the Ettore Moretti company selected silk on the basis of the drop in temperature at night on Monte Rosa. Up until the 70s, this material would become the standard for high-altitude climbing. The recently founded Moncler is one of the companies which supported the expedition, supplying down jackets for this historic enterprise. For these mountaineers, everything was new. They felt as if they needed to learn everything all over again, even the most elementary tasks, such as cooking pasta. They tried to boil pasta in the hyperbaric chamber at the Physiologic Institute at the University of Turin, using different types of gas up to an altitude of 11,000 meters. Propane gas was the most reliable, but due to the air pressure, it was impossible to cook it al dente. The shoemakers and seamstresses of the Giuseppe Garbuglio shoe factory, later Dolomite, worked overtime in order to churn out hundreds of boots. 5 pairs just for the climbers, and the rest for the scientists and the Hunza. These boots were fitted for high altitudes. They went up to the knee and were covered in reindeer fur on the outside and buffalo hide on the inside. Unlike previous expeditions, none of the mountaineers would be suffering from freeze injuries. For example, at 8,150 meters, on the last night, Lacedelli would find himself sleeping with his feet outside of the tent, due to it having been placed improperly on the site. Despite this, his feet wouldn't freeze. A few years later, Cesarino Benso Priarollo's brilliant design for an external ring lacing would even be used by NASA for the boots of the moon astronauts. The insole of all footwear was made of leather, supplied by the Prezò tanneries of Pordenone, and treated with full natural methods. Vitale Bramani from Milan was the inventor of the Vibram rubber soles. In 1937, only a select few mountaineers were already using them. This type of rubber was invented by Alp climber Bramani and Leopoldo Pirelli's brother-in-law, Franco Brambilla. The soles were called carro armato, or tank, and they were selected specifically for this expedition. And finally, despite the fact that only the British Himalayan expedition of '53 had opted to use them previously, this expedition made the essential decision of choosing to use oxygen tanks. The first challenge is complete. Once the equipment reaches the base of K2, it's time for the second, the climb proper. The team settles the base camps, and several passages are equipped with fixed ropes. These operations are essential. Without them, no one can hope to scale the mountain. But it's right at this moment that the mountain reminds its climbers that this is no place for men, and it does so in the most tragic way possible. In the middle of June, a blizzard hits the mountain. Compagnoni, Ray, and Puscio, who climbed the mountain to set Camp 4, are now forced to come down again. During the descent, Mario Puscio stops at Camp 2. He's suffering from a bad sore throat and fever. The doctor of the expedition reaches him to visit, but it's apparently nothing serious. During the night, Puscio's condition suddenly gets worse. Despite all best efforts, Mario Puscio dies at 1 a.m. on June 21st. At the time, it was thought to be bronchopneumonia. Today, we know that it was probably pulmonary edema, which is a severe mountain sickness that wasn't very well known at the time. Puscio was a skilled mountaineer and guide to the Mont Blanc Massif. He'd never left the mountains of Courmayeur, and he supported his family by working in the fields. Today, his memory is kept alive by plaques in Italian cities such as Courmayeur, of course, and the Stadium of Aosta. They'll have to wait 3 days for the blizzard to calm down temporarily so they can lower the body and bury it beneath the Abruzzi Spur. It's the same spot where just a year earlier, the Americans buried their own, Art Gilkey. It's a terrible blow for the entire expedition. For a moment, it's almost as if it's all over, that the venture is cancelled, but everyone soon decides that the best way to honor their friend is to keep on going. When the climbers leave Camp 8 for the last time, they undoubtedly have Mario Puscio and his sacrifice on their mind. Compagnoni and Lacedelli struggle as they make their way down the snowy slope. Compagnoni suddenly loses his footing and slides rapidly down for 200 meters before being saved by a pileup of snow. Another miracle. Then, finally, on the Abruzzi Spur, the group is able to use fixed ropes. These are the same ropes that previously allowed them to climb up and down safely, despite the weather. Late in the morning, they reach Camp 4, where Dr. Pagani attempts to cure the climbers' frostbite. Meanwhile, at the base camp, the wait is unbearable. Shortly after lunch, some porters notice a couple men in the distance. It's Florianini and Ray. A short race uphill among the rocks of the moraine, and finally the long-awaited news. The peak has been conquered. That night, a few climbers and Ardito Desio make their way to Camp 1, hoping to embrace their companions, but no one is there. They have to wait a few hours more, until late evening when the Balti porters yell out the arrival of Compagnoni and Lacedelli. The two men are suffering from thirst and exhaustion. Their hands are covered in bandages, and their faces are weathered by the sun. But they have made it. The mission is a success. Now, it's time for the legend of K2, which right from the start is hardly as bright as expected. The final stretch of the climb was made possible by Walter Bonatti, who left the 7,600 meters of Camp 8 on July 30th with Pino Gallotti to pick up the oxygen tanks left behind at Camp 7 at 7,345 meters and to bring them to the main team. This operation counted on the assistance of Abram and the two Hunza porters Isakan and Amir Mahdi. Bonatti alone had to endure the effort of descending 227 meters and then climbing back 500 at high altitude and carrying 19 kilos on his back. For the last push, only Mahdi was left by his side, as all the former mentioned companions had given in to exhaustion. Following this extraordinary endeavor, he also found himself forced to camp out in the open at 8,100 meters, which is something no mountaineer had ever experienced at that time. Bonatti would later demand several explanations. Where was the group he'd left at Camp 9? Why was the camp at 8,150 meters rather than the convened 7,900, which made transporting the oxygen tanks even harder? And why was he forced to camp in the open, which would later cost him and Mahdi serious amputations of their feet? Finally, he'll also point out inconsistencies in the official reports of the climb. The Club Alpino will have to wait until 1994 before acknowledging these faults in the successful expedition. Indeed, 10 years later, a commission will review the historical veracity of the facts and confirm Bonatti's version of events. On the morning of August 3rd, Atta Ullah, the Pakistani liaison officer, finally manages to get a ciphered telegram in English through to Skardu. The message will then make its way to Milan the following morning, but at 1 p.m. of that very August 3rd, Radio Pakistan announces the success of the Italian expedition. Indeed, that very evening, the first congratulations come in from the Karachi government by radio at the base camp. By order of Desio himself, the telegram doesn't include the name of the two climbers who actually reached the summit. In this way, the victorious climb appears to be more of a team effort. Meanwhile, celebrations are finally underway at the base camp. In the following days, Ardito Desio gives order for the return of the expedition. By this point, everyone is just thinking about making their way back home. Don't miss an episode of this series. Click on follow, and most importantly, hit the bell, and rate 5 stars on Spotify. K2, Like Going to the Moon, is a Cora Media podcast, created in partnership with Moncler. It is written by Leonardo Bizzaro, Roberto Mantovani, Vinicio Stefanello, Luca Calzolari. The voice is by John Vincent. Editorial care is by Marco Villa, with the support of Sarah Poma. Translation is by John Vincent. Sound and music supervision is by Luca Micheli. Post-production and editing is by Cosma Castellucci. Sound engineer is Luca Possi. The project manager is Silvia Arcidiacono Mutti. The producer is Alex Peverengo. Post-production coordination is by Matteo Scelsa. Editorial support, Valeria Luzzi.